speaker, Baroness James, who actually probably needs very little introduction. She started as a very eminent civil servant, moved on to be an international author, and then into the House of Lords, where her committee work has attracted attention, not only nationally but also internationally. I first met Baroness James on a train some 20 years ago, and she was incredibly discreet, never told me who she was, though I knew that this was P.D. James, and we had one of the most interesting conversations between London and Oxford. And it was fantastic when a year or so ago I met Phyllis again, and we served on several panels together, and we are delighted that she has agreed to come and be our after-dinner speaker. And one of the things we've been talking about is that it is very rare as gerontologists that we have the opportunity to actually learn from someone who at 93 has the real experience of the subject that we are trying to understand. So perhaps a welcome to Baroness James.
Start by saying, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, but I feel I'm really talking to friends. So I should say members of this college, gerontologists, and my friends. It's a great privilege as well as a pleasure to be speaking to you tonight. I'm afraid I haven't any real right to be here except a distinction which is nothing due to my cleverness, namely that I was born on the 3rd of August 1920, 2 years after the First World War ended, and therefore this August was 93, as you've just heard. So really I am one of these centenarians, of which there are 12,000, but there are going to be 1 million by the end of this century, who are causing you all so much trouble. Absolutely. And I hope that at the end of this you won't feel it would have been much better if I'd addressed you by talking about the keyboard mystery and how my new detective, noted gerontologist, Dr. Amelia Park-Muxon, discovered who had been dripping arsenic into the warden's goodnight cocoa. This is something rather different for me, and it will be just personal, as inevitably it must be. Well, to be 93, to be anything, I think, of that age, for most people, is to feel that you're totally alien from the world in which you are now living. It doesn't seem to have very much to compare with the world that you knew when you were young. It seems entirely different. And you are aware that because you've got white hair, you're very noticeable and your old stick is there, and you represent what is a minority maybe at the moment, but is soon going to be a majority of people who are feared, but on the whole somewhat resented. Sometimes quite kindly resented, but sometimes resented with real feeling, mostly by politicians and people very much in the public eye, who point out that we are no longer producing, we are just taking and not giving, and in fact this world is grossly overpopulated anyway, we are ruining our planet. And it would be more seemly if we decided it was time for us to depart. Well, some of us are quite ready to depart, when and where, but frankly the great majority of us are happy to go on. But unfortunately, those who are going on, we have to accept are living lives which can be dangerous, unpleasant, painful, and really hardly worth living. They live, very many of them, with pain. Some with a little pain, that's painkillers, the wonderful paracetamol can do something about, but some in pain that really can be described as agony, mostly from arthritis. They're very often severely disabled, so that they lose that wonderful feeling of being able just to get about and get about quickly. The pleasure which I miss most is just walking. taking a bus for a little way and then getting out and walking and going into museums and choosing new exhibits and going into a shop and see what the new fashions are and just getting myself a light lunch and then walking in a London park. It's that great pleasure. And I remember about a week ago I was looking out my bedroom window and I saw a group of young people. They were very young. They were quite tall. They had very long legs and they were wearing inevitably jeans on their long legs, and they were walking across the road overhead, and they were striding out. It was really, like a sort of automaton going like this. And in no time they crossed the road, and I thought, that's staggering. How on earth do they do that? And then my voice said, it's called walking, dear. You used to be able to do it. And I think that one of the things that is sad is the gradual loss of things that you could once do, and do quite easily. I mean, the eyes is always a problem in finding not spectacles generally, but spectacles you can read with comfortably. I've got 6 spectacles to read with comfortably, and I try them all every day, and none is entirely efficient. And there's that. And also, of course, there's sense of taste. The memory disappears a bit, especially for names. Very embarrassing when you have to introduce somebody who lives next door to you for 25 years and you can't remember what they're called. And all that's embarrassing. But I think the one that causes the most distress to us, and probably irritation to the rest of you, is the slow loss of hearing. And a bit of conversation that goes on in our family house is going on weekends in millions of houses, I think, all over the country. Isn't it time you put your hearing aid in, dear? No, I'm not putting it in for the moment. I'm managing quite well, thank you. And in any case, I'm wanting the batteries to last, and they don't last as long as they should, and it's very difficult to put them in. So, all right. Well, I don't think it is all right, dear. You didn't hear a word of what we were saying last weekend. I heard perfectly well. I'm not as deaf as you all think, and I wouldn't be deaf at all, except you all mumble. So that is our great excuse. You all mumble, all of you. Otherwise, we're not as deaf as we think. But that is a sad infliction, and it's not one very easy to remedy. But others, I think, are much more difficult. So many of people of my age, they do live incredibly lonely lives. They do feel isolated. They long to talk to people, but the people they long to talk to, of course, are no longer with us. Their dead husbands and children and lovers. And those are the ones they want back, and they're not going to come back. And in the meantime, while some of them feel, and I suppose that's a natural hope to have, that they will one day join them. It's not a hope I've ever been able to entertain myself, but I'm sure it gives some comfort. But in the meantime, they just want to talk to other human beings. They don't much want to join clubs, most of them. They feel that's rather terrifying. And they're not sure they'll like the people in the clubs. And getting to know new people is always a bit of a trial to them. But somebody who comes in regularly, and mostly this is the daily women. I don't know why we call them our daily women, because they mostly come in for an hour or two once a week and clean for us and do things like that. And they become familiar to the many old, and they talk together, and they feel that this is a friendly face. But one of my friends, and she is just exactly my age, and we met at primary school in London, in Shropshire, all those years ago. And she is really desperately lonely, and also very incapacitated by arthritis in her knees and in her legs and in her hands, so she can hardly use her hands. And she has help once a week from somebody coming in from the local authority. And the local authority knows and has admitted that she should have somebody coming in at least twice a week. But of course there's no money for it. And when I suggested we could find some money with no difficulty to pay somebody, there isn't anybody to pay. These people no longer exist. Those who do exist are already working very hard. And I suppose in one way we mostly think that if you've got money, it isn't as difficult. Well, money makes everything easier. And in some senses it isn't, because those of my friends who are very rich can afford to go into quite expensive care homes, and it's just a problem of trying to find one which you like, which is near the family, where people will visit and where you feel that you can take some of your own things. But the other alternative, of course, is to have full-time care. And I have a relation who has full-time care, a carer all the time, night and day. And that costs £1,000 a week. And not many people can afford that. And even so, it's very isolating. But those are the alternatives that are open to people who have the money for them. But the very great number of us are just staying in their homes, which they are desperate not to leave, and somehow coping. They're isolated, they're lonely, they're cold, and sometimes they're hungry. And I remember, and I suppose it was about a few months ago, I was in Marks and Spencer's. There was a very elderly lady, and she was trying to decide between two cardigans. One was pink and one was blue. She was holding them up against her. And not on impulse, I could see she was going for the blue. And I said, the blue is a lovely colour and it really does suit you. And we had a chat for about 10 minutes, and I'll never forget it. So I turned away, she said, thank you for speaking to me. And I've had this on my conscience, because you see, I had other things I wanted to do in Marks and Spencer's. But I should, and it didn't occur to me at the time, I said, well, why don't we have a cup of coffee upstairs? They've got a little cafe there, you can have coffee and biscuits and things. And had a proper talk with her. But I didn't. But there are thousands of people like that, and really they need someone to talk to, someone sympathetic, someone familiar. I gather there's a new idea of what is Miss Ransom's, I forget her name, her first name, but she has got something called the Silver Link, and it does sound to me an excellent idea. And this is volunteers who will telephone really lonely people and talk to them, and can be telephoned back. And I know with my friends that the telephone means a tremendous lot when I do telephone, and I try to telephone as much as I can. And that sounds to me an excellent idea. If the volunteers are the right kind of people, they will like to hear some of the stories of old people. They've got amazing stories, some of these old people, especially the centenarians. And they're very well worth listening to. And I try and persuade them when I talk to them. Just record them. They say, well, I couldn't possibly write them down. And I say, you don't need to write them down. Get one of your family, and of course they've all got young people who've got all these wonderful marvels, and they'll bring a recording thing, and you just speak into it, just as naturally as you would to your son or your daughter or a grandchild. Because we need to have all these records. They're important. You have lived through an incredible age. We have lived through an amazing age. One of huge changes after a ghastly war, and we were born into a country. I remember it when I grew up in Ludlow. It was like living in a country where there was a kind of universal grieving. And that was the result of the First World War. There was hardly a home that hadn't been touched by that war. And there was this sense of universal grieving. And then there were all sorts of problems, unemployment, difficulties really, with life generally for people. And then very soon the prospect that there would be another war. And the same again, the same horror and the same death, the same danger, only this time perhaps even worse. And then, of course, that extraordinary mushroom, well, I suppose before then, there was the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I can remember I had my younger daughter in her high chair then and was feeding her breakfast. And we heard the news. And I can absolutely remember the mixture of absolute triumph and horror in the newskeepers, the news teller's voice. He said, we have dropped the power of the sun itself. And then he said, there'll be all sorts of wonderful uses for this marvelous new power. But one knew that something terrible had happened, and nothing could undo it, and the world was never going to be the same again. And in a sense, and it seems a silly perhaps comparison to make, But this huge challenge of overpopulation and what we are doing to our planet is going to be just as devastating, and it has to be tackled by this generation. And I'd like to say that you, who are gerontologists, I have such an admiration for, and if I may speak as a patient for many patients, we are very, very grateful. It may not be the most glamorous specialty of medicine, but my goodness, I think it does more good than all the others put together, because it embraces the whole of medicine. And it is practiced by people who, it seems to me, really care about their patients and are able to have that rapport with them, that mutual sympathy and understanding that not only makes a great difference to the patient, but a great difference to the patient's family and all who come in touch with him or her, and a huge difference to the country as a whole. So that you're going to have to be in the vanguard, I think, of anything that does happen to make life easier for these people. And all sorts of small things occur to me in a way, I suppose, but talking of my friends who are my age, and none of them is actually older, we ought really to encourage people in more ways to arrange for old age before it actually occurs. For example, if they live in a house which they know is going to be too large for them, too difficult to run, but which they dearly love, and believe me, we absolutely hate leaving our homes, because they are the safe places. And when people are old, and they've said this to me, I can wander around here, I know where everything is, I know where to find everything, I can manage the stairs, I've got the stair lift now. And the idea that all this is lost is terrifying to them. But sometimes it has to be lost. It's much better faced before retirement, from 55 onwards, when you face where do you want to live in extreme old age if you're lucky enough to reach it, or unlucky enough to reach it. And the one mistake that's frequently made is people have been very happy with their families when they've been at the seaside, a nice seaside town. Wouldn't it be nice to be at Bexhill? Well, it might not be nice if you don't know anybody there. You want to look at it and say to yourself, where are the shops? Where is the station? Where is the life of this community? Where will I find my friends? The place may be fine for on holiday, but is it fine? And it gives you time to think about these things, and time also to think where you're going to find the money. And maybe it would be useful if governments issued bonds for people in this situation, whereby they would get a fairly modest return, but the bond would be big enough when they retired to add to their lump sum, which they usually get, especially if they've been in public service, and give a little leeway where the money is concerned. So that's one idea. The other thing I thought but I think it's been overcome really by other people thinking the same. It would be a good thing if every very old person had a mentor, somebody who really was a friend, somebody who would have the right to talk to the social services, to talk to the doctor about the patient's progress there, could meet little needs if this was a very lonely person, could try and arrange meetings with friends who might be congenial, who could telephone, who could give the person a feeling that it was good to be alive, it was right to be alive, it was not to be banished and regarded as a nuisance. And I gather that now general practitioners are being, one GP must be, as it were, every old person must have a GP who will look after her. Well, I'm not very sanguine about that, because it seems to me the GPs are going to be busier than they have been if there's a new agreement about their conditions of service. And things tend to just not happen if they're not the facilities to make them happen and the will to make them happen. We need to tackle this in a far more vigorous way, I think. And for heaven's sake, shan't we do something about the recruitment? Where do these appalling so-called nurses come from? Whoever employs them? People who are not just negligent, people who are actively cruel to helpless patients. I mean, it is unbelievable. It really is unbelievable. And I think it seems to me we live in a sort of society in which every week we hear of some fresh terrible horror, and we all say, isn't it ghastly? And we hold up our hands in disgust at it, and then it just goes. Nothing ever seems to happen to stop it. And we're now in a situation, really, where some of my elderly friends will not go into hospital. And once they've heard of the so-called Liverpool pathway, they certainly have no intention of going to hospital at all. And that any civilized country could possibly think of withdrawing water, compulsory withdrawing water, not even letting relatives give the patient water, from any patient who was down, just makes me wonder really what state we're all in and how we arrived at a state when we could even do that. In the meantime, here are all these people, and just needing some help, and sometimes just a little will make all the difference. And the regular telephone calls, the visits, but most of all the medical care. And I gather now there's going to be some, again, complete reorganization of the health service, largely of course because of the beds that are blocked. And it's an awful thing when you're in bed in hospital, just realizing you're just resented because you shouldn't be there. And it's not your fault you're there. It's not your fault that you're too sick to go home and look after yourself. But nevertheless, you are aware that you shouldn't be blocking that bed. And I found myself saying when they were doing some investigations which might have resulted in something serious, I don't want an expensive operation. I don't want to block a bed. I just want to be kept comfortable and free of pain. And then I'll go quite quietly. I don't want anything else done. But I mean, that's all right in 93 and quite a logical view to take. But I don't think it should be taken by people who are much younger than I am. And that they should be made, just because they are old, to feel that they are an absolute nuisance. And it would be very much better if they died. It's a horrible thought, but that is what is on their minds, I'm afraid, all the time. And it can be on your mind if you're isolated, if you're lonely, if you haven't anybody who's really friendly with you, who will just call in occasionally for a cup of tea and a chat. It's not much that people are asking. They're just asking for certain rights which we normally just give to human beings because we are all human beings together. And I think that we just have to care a little more, and society has to care a little more. And possibly if the money is really short, we have to think where we shall find the money. What else can we do without? What else is maybe somewhat overfunded? And it may not need an awful lot of money to make life different. Even if people like my friend who's only seen once a week, only has help in her house once a week, and has to crawl around in bed trying to make it in the morning, and spends her night sitting on the end of the bed with her legs dangling because that seems to relieve the pain a bit. And I've sort of struggled with her circumstances and said that she must have, as all the other things have failed, a morphia patch. And she has had one. It hasn't worked very much, but she's now got one stronger and is beginning to work a little. And I hope very much that that will mean that the worst of the pain will go, or at least be less acute. I don't see how anybody can live happily if they're constantly living in pain. So the medical care is tremendously important, and the reduction of pain. And this idea that now I think that then they must be treated at home because it's too expensive to go on in a hospital when they have to be moved from specialty to specialty, from ward to ward. And I think that far more could be done with them in home or in smaller nursing homes where they could get the kind of care they need. I think my sister, if I can be personal again, she's only 18 months younger than I am. She's had a much harder life, a life of some poverty and striving. But she has 4 daughters who are wonderful daughters to her, and she now lives in a little flat which is in secure accommodation. And she lives a very satisfactory life, although she's not well, and in many ways she's not as well as I am. But she has friends who come in 2 days a week. She sees these friends. 2 other days, she has a bus come. It goes round to town, collecting people who go to the Old People's Club. Well, the Old People's Club is not something that all old people like, but Monica likes it because she likes talking to people. There are lots of people to talk to. And what she greatly enjoys is teaching dominoes to the old gentlemen who are now pretty well, in their dotage. And she said that you say to them patiently, now George, you have got a 4 on yours. Can you see a 4 on the table where it could go? And when they see it and put the 4 against it, they're absolutely thrilled. And she said, it's wonderful. And she just loves this very much. And that really counts. And then when her elder daughter comes to bath her and wash her hair and see that the fridge is full of food, that becomes her weekend, her week. And it's an entirely satisfactory week. She feels useful, she's doing something useful, she has companionship, she's not isolated, she's not lonely, and she has good family. And that's what we hope for absolutely everybody. And let us hope somehow we manage to achieve it. But as I say, you will be in the vanguard of this struggle, and it's going to be a struggle. And there'll be no shortage of bright ideas. Some may work and some may not. The poor health service has been overturned time and time again, that I almost tremble to think of being overturned yet one time. Only education has failed, has had worse treatment in this regard, I think. But there we are, we struggle on. And I was just sort of going to end, because it suits me to end in this way, being selfish. I noticed with my friends that although now they are very old, and they're certainly my age or roughly, they're never really frightened of dying. We don't discuss dying. I mean, if we do discuss it, it's really rather jolly things of what you're going to have at your funeral and so on, what people you're going to have. But we don't really see, I don't know whether that is your experience as clinicians. I mean, it is very horrible when someone old is really distressed, as the poet Larkin was, really terrified of dying. It may seem to us irrational, because it is irrational, but it can be a very real fear. But I have noticed that, in fact, they don't seem to be worried about that. And I certainly feel that by 93, if you haven't come to terms with death, it's a great pity. But I always look, indeed, to Shakespeare for my comfort in these matters, and this one particularly. And it's from Hamlet, of course. Most of our quotations seem to come from Hamlet. Not a whit, we defy augury. There's a special provision in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it is not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. The readiness is all. And